Hello, everyone. Tonight, we will explore the unusual, ambitious, and sometimes surprisingly eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. This was an era where the main goal wasn't to look healthy, but rather to seem as if you had just completed some minor and polite exertion. So, before we begin, please take a second to gently tap the like button and think about subscribing if you enjoy the content I create here. Also, I'd love for you to share where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It is always fascinating to see who is joining in from across the globe. Now, you might want to dim the lights, maybe turn on a quiet fan for some gentle background noise, and let's drift together into this evening's journey through history. In the medieval period, having a pale complexion wasn't a sign that you were tired. Instead, it was a clear fashion statement, a subtle display of social standing, a quiet announcement to everyone that said, "I am far too wealthy to ever need to work in the sun. Thank you." Unlike our modern times, where a sun-kissed glow might suggest activities like yoga, drinking smoothies, or a nice trip to the coast, medieval beauty ideals were the complete opposite. A tan explicitly meant that you labored outdoors, which suggested you were poor and engaged in manual work. And in the 14th century, nothing was considered less beautiful than knowing how to milk a cow. Therefore, the lighter your skin, the higher your social status was thought to be. When we talk about pale, we don't just mean a soft, ivory tone. We are referring to skin that was almost translucent, like porcelain, often with visible veins underneath. It was a complexion so light it looked as if you had recently been frightened by a ghost or perhaps were a ghost yourself. Of course, nature doesn't always give you this look, especially if you were born with a normal, functioning circulatory system. So people found ways to help it along. Noble women, and sometimes men, would apply white lead powder to their faces. This gave them that distinctive, corpse-like radiance and, as an added feature, slowly poisoned them. But beauty, then as now, always had its price. Some people would use cloths soaked in vinegar to try and bleach their skin. Others applied a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites. This blend not only lightened the skin but also had the unique side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelet. To further create an appearance of delicacy, veins were sometimes carefully painted onto the arms and chest with blue pigment. It seems that nothing conveyed nobility quite like pretending your skin was about to split open. Even literature adopted this preference. Romantic poetry often described women as being pale as milk, white as snow, and in one notable case, like the moon in winter, which is a very poetic way of saying she looked as though she might faint at any moment. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about looks. It was a shortcut to signify social class, purity, and a total separation from agricultural work. If you had the ability to appear fragile, you were, by the standards of the Middle Ages, definitely succeeding. Beauty in medieval times often required a serious commitment. And by commitment, I mean a slow, decorative kind of chemical attack on oneself. For those who were relentlessly trying to achieve that esteemed pale look, nature just wasn't enough. So, they turned to cosmetics, particularly lead-based white face powder. Yes, lead, the same substance we now carefully remove from old buildings. Back then, however, it was seen as incredibly modern. The effect was a smooth, pale, matte surface, the medieval version of a high-coverage foundation. It made the skin look perfect and, in the long run, feel very much the opposite. White lead powder was created by mixing vinegar with metal, which was then allowed to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a powder. If you applied that every day, you looked like a glowing, delicate noble with a hidden, subtle death wish. And if your skin started to flake, blister, or even fall off in small pieces, that was even better. Probably meant the makeup was working as intended. This wasn't a one-product routine either. Many people added mercury-based rouge for a hint of color or chalk dust to make it last longer. Egg whites were often brushed over the face to create a smooth, glazed look. Essentially, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's lab, someone somewhere had likely put it on their face in the quest for elegance. The downside, apart from the slow poisoning, was that lead-based products led to everything from constant fatigue and skin ulcers to major hair loss and an early death, symptoms you typically don't find on modern skincare products. But the trend continued, because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a commoner, the nobility often chose the scenic path to the grave. Men were not always exempt from these trends. Some male courtiers also used powders or skin treatments, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance periods, where one's image was almost as important as their family line, or at least as important as smelling slightly better than a rival. Of all the beauty trends in the Middle Ages, the obsession with high foreheads might be the most. Eyebrow raising, literally because people were getting rid of their eyebrows for it. A tall, smooth, unbroken forehead was not just in fashion. It was thought to be exceptionally elegant, a sign of intellect and even divinity. It was the architectural wonder of the medieval face. The perfect forehead seemed to say, "I spend my days peacefully reading psalms and looking thoughtfully out of castle windows," instead of, "I know how to use a shovel." To get this noble appearance, women took extreme and, to be honest, rather itchy steps. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, and sometimes even hair at the scalp was carefully removed, inch by inch, to move the hairline back. This was not a simple trim. It was a full-scale forehead enlarging project. Medieval grooming guides told women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and creams made from things like cat droppings, quicklime, or leeches soaked in vinegar, all for the sake of showing off a forehead that could practically be used as a sundial. The results were noticeable. Portraits from that time show women with calm expressions and foreheads so large you could imagine holding a joust on them. When combined with their pale skin and soft features, this high dome look became a symbol of refined beauty. It wasn't just about the face either. Fashion was designed to support this look. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and hennons, those well-known cone-shaped hats, all helped to pull the hairline up or at least hide the area where eyebrows used to be. And this wasn't just a trend in one isolated castle. From England to France to Italy, noble women adopted the high forehead style, while artists and poets supported it by praising women whose faces seemed to start near the top of their heads. Of course, not everyone had the time or the tools to pluck themselves into this ideal look. So, in a moment of medieval creativity, some women faked it by drawing a new forehead slightly higher and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's correct. The Middle Ages had its own form of contouring. It just used a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows were not just unappreciated. They were actively removed. While today's trends might favor bold, feathered brows, in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were mostly seen as unwanted clutter on the face. To get the ideal look, women carefully plucked their eyebrows until they were almost gone or removed them entirely. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was seen as the height of elegance and refinement, and any sign of hair growth ruined this desired look. Eyebrows were basically seen as stubborn weeds in the facial garden. Some people went even further and shaved the brow area completely, making sure not a single hair interfered with their smooth, high-domed magnificence. It's the kind of commitment that would make today's beauty influencers look twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils available to draw them back on. To remove their brows, medieval women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or, for the especially brave, concoctions containing quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Yes, arsenic. Because nothing shows dedication to your appearance like risking a mild chemical burn on your face. This was more than just a passing trend. Art from the time, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, consistently shows this widespread fashion. Noble women are often shown with smooth foreheads and seemingly blank eyes, framed by nothing but skin. The effect is either serene or, depending on the light, a bit alien. Interestingly, the no-brow trend was not the same all across Europe. In some areas, thin or lightly arched brows remained, especially as cultural influences from the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire came in through trade and war. But for the most part, the main idea was clear. If people could see your eyebrows, you were doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those in court life, sometimes trimmed or subtly groomed their brows as part of a general look of refinement. However, complete removal was uncommon among men, unless, of course, they had lost them during a particularly intense theological argument. What all of this shows is that medieval beauty standards were not about looking natural. They were about looking carefully curated, symbolic, and maybe just a little bit angelic. After all, angels are rarely shown with brows in art. Is that a coincidence? Perhaps, but it definitely worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a bit of color in your cheeks was thought to be attractive. But like most things in medieval life, there were strict rules, possible social consequences, and a slight chance of eternal punishment. The ideal was a faint blush, as if you had just heard a slightly scandalous poem or had been outside for 30 seconds, but definitely not long enough to get a tan. A soft, rosy color on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and being generally alive. All of these were very desirable qualities, especially if you could keep them past the age of 28. However, you absolutely could not look like you were trying to get this look. Applying rouge was seen as an act of vanity, and vanity was dangerously close to sin. The church, as you might expect, was not happy about women putting color on their faces, unless, of course, they were nobles or were doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area that scholars are still trying to figure out. Still, women found ways to get around this. Common ingredients for blush included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even cochineal, a deep red color made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs, because beauty, as we know, has always had its less pleasant side. Some women just rubbed their cheeks to get a natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment, applied carefully to avoid being noticed by both disapproving priests and nosy neighbors. For the very rich, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were extremely toxic. But the thinking was something like, I might die young, but I'll die with rosy cheeks and social respect. Rouge was usually applied with a cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was handy that hadn't just been used to season a pot of stew. Since mirrors were rare, many women had to rely on instinct, habit, or a very honest maid. Of course, if your blush was too obvious, you could be accused of trying to look like a prostitute or, even worse, a French courtier. The horror. The goal was always a modest improvement, never a dramatic statement. And if someone complimented your rosy glow, you were expected to deny it completely and say something vague about the wind. Even nuns sometimes wore a tiny bit of rouge, supposedly only on feast days, because nothing says, I serve the Lord, like a tasteful touch of beetroot applied behind the convent walls. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been touched by holy light or perhaps stolen from an angel in a painting, you were already at a disadvantage. Blonde hair, specifically, was the undeniable gold standard of the time. It was consistently linked with youth, great beauty, virtue, and, if you needed a divine seal of approval, the Virgin Mary was often shown as a blonde, even though, geographically, she almost certainly was not. But being realistic was considered much less important than radiating a sense of heavenly glow. If you were naturally born with blonde hair, congratulations. You were thought to be blessed and probably got out of a few chores. However, natural blonde hair didn't always last, especially into adulthood. So, medieval women took things into their own hands and sometimes into bubbling pots. Homemade hair lightening mixtures included things like saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye. These blends were applied generously and then left to bake in the sun, a method known as sunbasking. It worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a lizard. Some recipes even used urine, which was thought to help lighten hair color. Whose urine? That detail was not well regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that desired heavenly shine, it was considered worthwhile. Beauty, as it has always been, was often a little bit gross. Hair texture was also very important. Loose, long, wavy hair was the ideal, preferably flowing down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxurious display was only for unmarried women. Once you were married, your golden hair was expected to be carefully hidden under veils, nets, and various head coverings. Because it seems the moment you said, I do, your hair suddenly became a national security threat. For noble women, hair was often intricately braided, twisted, or tucked into complex styles, especially for court or religious events. These elaborate hairstyles were often decorated with luxurious silk ribbons, precious beads, or delicate embroidery, just in case you needed to subtly remind everyone in the room that you definitely didn't shear sheep for a living. Men were not entirely left out either. While they weren't subjected to the same intense standards, men with thick, golden hair were often idealized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle were basically the medieval version of a shampoo commercial. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless, of course, you were trying to get married. Then, all of a sudden, it became a strategic tool. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose, as a symbol of purity and innocence. Though it couldn't be too loose unless you were specifically going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a simple, neat braid was enough. But once you were married, your hair was immediately hidden from public view. Congratulations! You now had a husband and a clear duty to wrap up your hair more tightly than a monastery's budget for wine. This brings us to the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs. A medieval collection of modest headwear that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of plain beige linen. These coverings weren't just for modesty. They were also very practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and any unwanted compliments from wandering musicians. The most dedicated women layered their head coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned under a wimple that was carefully wrapped under the chin. The overall effect? You looked like a devout, well-wrapped sandwich, and that was exactly the point. But fashion is rarely happy with just being functional. As time went on, headwear became more and more elaborate. Nets were intricately embroidered with shiny gold thread. Veils were starched into dramatic geometric shapes. Some noblewomen even wore silk cages for their braids, decorated with sparkling jewels and tiny bells, because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling gently every time you turn your head. In many cultures, hidden hair was directly connected to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could lead to unflattering comparisons to a lady of the night, or even worse, a French woman. Of course, some women subtly rebelled. They would let a small curl artfully slip out, or wear see-through veils that technically counted as covered, while still letting the world see their carefully dyed hair. Medieval loopholes were very much a thing. If medieval beauty followed one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your height. By the 15th century, women across Europe started to adopt a fashion trend that literally raised their appearance. The hennin. You know the one, those tall, cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent a bit too much time looking at church steeples. The hennin wasn't just headwear. It was basically a social ladder you wore on your head. These hats could be over 2 feet tall, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian nobility. The taller the hennin, the higher your social status was thought to be, and consequently, the more doorways you probably hit on your way to dinner. Often carefully made from fine silk, luxurious velvet, or rich brocade, hennins were built with delicate wire frames, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil usually flowed gracefully from the tip, adding movement, an air of mystery, and a good chance of accidentally catching fire from a candle. Now, getting your hair to fit neatly under one of these elaborate creations was a skill in itself. Hair was usually braided and carefully stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. That forehead real estate, again, to help the hennin sit correctly. Comfort was clearly not a priority in the design. But hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escoffions, which looked like 2 croissants delicately glued to each side of the head, or butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like delicate wings, great for dramatic effect, not so much for a sudden downpour. Outside of the nobility, most women stuck to simpler veils, practical linen caps, or modest headbands. Simpler, much less dangerous, and far less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. The clergy and conservative thinkers, as you might guess, were not very enthusiastic about these trends. They warned that such showing off led to vanity, sin, and quite possibly severe neck pain. Still, hennins remained very popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but undeniably fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear tall cones, they certainly had their own unique style statements. Think of feathered caps, luxurious fur-trimmed hoods, and remarkably pointy shoes that could easily be used as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body was not supposed to be athletic, obviously curvy, or toned. No, the main goal was to look delicate, modest, and perhaps subtly recovering from a recent faint. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who lived mainly on honey water, the elegant words of courtly poems, and maybe one fig a week. Beauty guides from the time certainly didn't tell women to build strength or stamina. The only lifting you were expected to do was the graceful lifting of your veil in a flirtatious way before quickly looking away and perhaps gently fainting. However, this wasn't about looking obviously sick, at least not in a clear way. The sweet spot was somewhere between being too weak to carry a bucket and still being perfectly able to play the lute while sitting down. A graceful, slender figure was strongly associated with the nobility because, of course, if you were involved in manual labor, you would naturally have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the unfortunate result of visible muscle tone. The focus was on a narrow waist, subtly soft curves, and a general look of spiritual tiredness. The waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist, to make the torso look longer and create an illusion of both height and fragility. And if that illusion needed a little help, tight lacing was readily available. Not quite corsets, which came later, but tightly bound kirtles and girdles did the job just fine. Being too thin, however, was also not the goal. In times of famine or plague, being extremely thin was a major red flag, suggesting that the person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, especially in the face or hips, was considered both healthy and a sign of fertility. Basically, if you looked like you could comfortably make it through winter and still write poetry, you were in the ideal range. Diet advice from the period was not exactly well-balanced. Beauty guides recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for fresh breath, and drinking wine to improve one's complexion. Protein was only suggested if it still had a feather on it. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more physical substance. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and the clear ability to carry a sword without falling over. But even for men, the nobility generally preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not obvious brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her quiet power. They were the medieval version of sending a subtly flirty emoji, just with more spiritual meaning and a bit less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue, and maybe just a little bit sad." Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally seen the fall of man and were still politely getting over it. Poets of the time couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely, if ever, mentioned was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes, especially blue or gray, were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general belief that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were also admired, especially if they came with a noble family line and a good dowry. Making the eyes look better was difficult. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal soot and a lot of hope. Some women dabbed a little black powder around their lashes to make their eyes look larger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or accidentally creating the world's first smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and good lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look down at all times, even if it meant tripping over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were often admired. This suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and maybe that you had just finished praying or reading something inspiring like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or going through mild public embarrassment usually worked. As for eye contact, it was a delicate matter. Too much could be seen as bold, flirty, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming dishonest or, worse, possessed. The trick was to occasionally look up from under lowered eyelids, like someone who had memorized the Bible but wasn't going to openly boast about it. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath, specifically what it smelled like, while a knight might write poetically about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth. He usually tactfully left out what happened when those lips opened. This is because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, a goal, and minty freshness hadn't been invented yet. Unless, of course, you count standing near an herb garden and just hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth subtly suggested youth, good health, and the convenient fact that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically you probably had. Medieval women did what they could to lessen this. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and sometimes even twigs. These weren't just for flavor. They were chewed specifically to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of chewing gum. It didn't make your teeth sparkle, but it made you a bit more kissable, or at least less scary in a close conversation. For those who could get to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were used sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit too much. Toothbrushing, as we know it today, was not a common practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloths, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small, fibrous twigs that could scrub and also serve as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while bad breath wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered particularly shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had much more important concerns, such as surviving winter or avoiding being accused and burned as a heretic. For noble women, the main goal was to minimize offense while keeping an air of grace. Conversations usually took place at a respectable arm's length. Public displays of affection were limited, and when in doubt, the strategy was to fan yourself gently and look thoughtful. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, a scented ball filled with fragrant herbs, to discreetly wave in your own direction when needed. In modern times, a bright smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, however, a smile was a risky thing, best used in moderation, much like exotic spices or unexpected peasant uprisings. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly at its best. Teeth were certainly important, yes, but mainly for the practical purpose of chewing bread, rather than for charming potential partners. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively frightening, especially by the age of 30. So, the fewer people who saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to neglect. Tooth decay was common, mostly because of diets heavy in bread, porridge, and mead, and a complete lack of toothbrushes, dental floss, or any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely eaten in most of Europe yet, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-damaging problems. Furthermore, dental surgery at the time was basically an exorcism done with pliers. Despite these difficulties, a healthy smile was quietly admired, though definitely not openly celebrated. White, evenly spaced teeth were rare and seen as a sign of youth, good luck, and maybe even a small miracle. But people were not walking around with big, toothy grins like in medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a modest, closed-lip smile was considered much more fashionable. Think, I might be thinking about a sonnet, rather than, I'm so happy to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try to clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were somewhat effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing your teeth with sand and just hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not shown off. Medieval art, for instance, almost never shows open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels typically kept their mouths politely closed, as if they, too, were quietly aware of the risks of showing too much. Men were not exempt from these dental realities either. A knight might indeed win a lady's heart with his bravery and strong jawline, but no romantic song ever included the line, "His pearly whites shone like ivory." There's a very good reason why troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and teeth alignment. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were surprisingly specific. You didn't have to be sculpted like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you had just fallen off a wagon of hay. The ideal balance was somewhere between being ready for a joust and being able to write a good poem about jousting without actually doing it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and, very importantly, nobly calm. Not overly muscular, that suggested manual labor, but definitely not soft either, as that suggested laziness or too much fondness for mead. You wanted to give the impression that you could easily swing a sword, but only if your assistant was conveniently busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think prince in an old manuscript, rather than village strongman. A well-groomed beard or a smoothly clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the specific area and time. But either way, it needed to look deliberate, not like you had been lost in the forest for a week. Hair was usually shoulder length and carefully styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were fashionable in many courts, especially if they were natural or looked natural. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really, small heated rods or herbal rinses were used to improve texture and shine. Because nothing says, "I am above manual labor," like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy carefully styles your hair. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male figure. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics all helped to create the ideal body shape, with extra focus on perfect posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He moved gracefully, often with a slight hint of disdain. And if a man happened to be naturally muscular, that was perfectly fine, as long as he wasn't actually seen doing manual labor with those muscles. Fighting in wars was allowed. Carrying barrels was not. Above all, the desired look was one of effortless charm. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble. And that natural nobility alone made you appealing, a kind of medieval version of being hot without trying. Except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In a time when bathing was basically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, managing scents became a complex art. And not the glamorous walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5 kind of art, but more of the mask and pray type. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we might hope, especially depending on the specific century, location, and how often the plague was around. So, to avoid offending noses, both human and, presumably, divine medieval men and women turned to the scented power of herbs, oils, and perfumed bags. Let's start with the pomander. This was a small, hollow ball, usually made of metal, worn on a chain or pinned to clothing, and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and sometimes something mysteriously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for looks, they were basically portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a discreet air freshener. The nobility also liked perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was considered fair game for scent enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes sprinkled with floral waters or vinegar infusions that smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people definitely perspired. Medieval clothes were heavy, summers were hot, and effective deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution: layers of linen which absorbed sweat and could be washed more often than the heavier woolen or silk outer clothes. Some people added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to fight odor with fragrant optimism. Bathhouses were a thing, especially during the early and late medieval periods, but access varied greatly. The church eventually started to disapprove of public nudity, which definitely put a stop to widespread enthusiasm for hygiene. So many people resorted to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. Wiping oneself with a cloth, then splashing on scented water, and just pretending that counted as being clean. And then there were the overachievers. People who carefully kept flower petals in their shoes or thoughtfully stuffed herbs into their bed linens to smell vaguely like someone who had recently been in a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just about appearances. It was deeply connected to morality. A well-composed face could be seen as a divine gift, a powerful social tool, or a clever trap set by the devil himself, sometimes all three before breakfast. To be considered beautiful was to walk a very thin line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, a pale complexion, was often seen as a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it suggested you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least, unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters all described beauty as physical proof of a pure soul. But there was a big catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you actively used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspicious. Vanity was a sin, remember, and showing too much interest in one's own appearance subtly suggested pride, seduction, or, worst of all, French habits. Medieval sermons often warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which, of course, was entirely the woman's fault. Eve set a clear example, and medieval Europe followed it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, letting a bit of hair show, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright evil. Some even believed that beauty itself could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a powerful spell created by witches to lead good men astray. This might sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when even bad weather could potentially get you burned at the stake. On the other hand, those who were plain or unattractive were sometimes thought to be morally flawed or just unlucky. The idea that outer appearance directly reflected inner character wasn't just popular. It was often a belief in certain circles. Beauty suggested grace. Ugliness suggested punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things incredibly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or a strangely convenient illness. So, in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about looks. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, carefully balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup box. Music fades out completely. New, perhaps slightly more dramatic, but still calm music begins. The Persian immortals were much more than just elite soldiers. They were a profound statement, a living symbol of imperial power, careful precision, and unbreakable continuity. Their story begins with the very start of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. At a time when Persia was quickly growing from a local power into a massive empire, Cyrus understood something crucial. An empire needs a strong foundation, not just skilled administrators and governors, but an elite force that can show dominance, inspire loyalty, and put down rebellions with equal skill. Thus, the Immortals were created. The name, Immortals, wasn't just a fancy title. It was a clever logistical and psychological move. According to the historian Herodotus, their number was always kept at exactly 10,000 men. If one man died, got sick, or was wounded, he was immediately replaced. Their numbers never changed. From the outside, it looked as though they could not be reduced, could not be weakened, and, most importantly, could not die. Whether this was strictly true or just clever accounting, the powerful image certainly stuck, and the name lasted. Immortality, in this case, wasn't about individual survival. It was about the eternal, unchanging presence of Persian strength. These men were not just random soldiers. To become an immortal meant being carefully chosen from the Persian nobility or, at the very least, from families of high status and proven loyalty. Training started at a young age, and discipline was famously harsh. Loyalty to the king was completely unquestionable. They were expected to be not just great warriors, but examples of Achaemenid values: order, absolute obedience, and unwavering calmness under great pressure. They were also richly dressed, wearing robes of fine materials, with subtle scale armor under their outer clothes, and usually armed with a spear, a bow, a short sword, and a strong wicker shield. Their appearance was as carefully planned as their military strategies. Persian kings were not just sending warriors into battle. They were sending a mobile political message, elegantly wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire grew, the Immortals were close behind. They stood firmly behind kings, proudly next to thrones, and fearlessly at the very front of the battlefield. If you saw them coming, you didn't just see soldiers. You saw the unbroken heartbeat of the empire. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals simply endured. And that exactly is what made them so terrifying. The appearance of the Persian immortals was not just a coincidence. It was, in fact, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. These men were not covered from head to toe in shiny bronze, like the Greek hoplites. No, the immortals had an otherworldly look, like a calm wave of richly dressed shadows gracefully sweeping across the land. Their uniforms skillfully combined royal elegance with essential military function. They wore elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers, often dyed in rich reds and purples, colors traditionally associated with nobility and command. Underneath these outer layers was a protective layer of scale armor, made from bronze or iron, flexible enough for quick movement yet deadly in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, surprisingly light yet remarkably good at deflecting arrows and absorbing powerful hits. Their most unique feature, however, was their headdress. A soft felt cap known as a tiara, sometimes intentionally pulled over the face to hide individual identity. Unlike the Greeks, who valued individuality in armor and bravery, the immortals excelled in perfect sameness. 10,000 men moving in almost perfect silence, all similarly armed and armored, created a visual display that overwhelmed the senses. It was like watching a precise curtain of death come down on the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver of arrows, and a short sword or a dagger on their belt. But perhaps most impressive was their natural ability to move quickly and remain deadly in almost any type of land. Their tough training focused on agility and endurance over brute strength. They could march across entire provinces without ever breaking their formation. And unlike many other ancient armies, the immortals were equally skilled at fighting in open battle or serving as formidable imperial guards in royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to allow for quick deployment, yet powerful enough to both intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about raw brute force. It was about unwavering consistency, about never failing, never faltering, and never looking vulnerable. And that consistency, combined with the subtle mystery of their appearance, was key in creating their lasting legend. When they marched into battle, drums would beat rhythmically and dust would rise behind them, but their expressions remained eerily calm. There was no roaring, no boasting, just an unsettling, synchronized precision. It was as if they were not men, but rather machines, made not of flesh, but of sheer discipline, ritual, and instilled fear. To face the immortals was not just to face death. It was to confront an idea that some armies didn't just fight, they endured without pause or pity. To be an immortal was not just a job. It was a lifelong identity, a significant status symbol, and in some ways a predetermined sentence. While they were respected and well rewarded, the expectations placed on them were huge. These men lived under constant observation. Their food, clothing, and housing were all carefully provided by the state, but not just out of kindness. It was to ensure absolute control. From the moment they joined the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but entirely to the empire. Most immortals came from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but lower-ranking sons of loyal families could also join if they showed exceptional discipline. Training began in childhood, often in military academies directly connected to the royal court. Boys learned archery on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in perfect step, and most importantly, how to obey without any hesitation. There was no room for personal glory-seeking or individual ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was quickly corrected. The formation was considered sacred. Unity was more important than anything else. Discipline controlled every aspect of their lives. They followed a strict daily routine, waking before dawn, drilling in silence, carefully maintaining their weapons and armor. Meals were eaten together, always modest, and always nutritionally planned for sustained endurance. Meat, flatbread, dates, and wine were common, but luxuries were actively discouraged. The empire needed formidable warriors, not pampered nobles. When not on a military campaign, the immortals served as guards for the king and his court. But even then, their duties went beyond just ceremony. They stood guard against assassination attempts, discreetly watched nobles for any signs of disloyalty, and maintained order in the most unstable places of the empire. Their very presence alone could stop dissent in a royal hall. They acted as the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. Interestingly, they weren't completely cut off from family life. Immortals were allowed to marry and have households. However, they could be called for duty at a moment's notice. When duty called, they left everything behind, no questions asked. A man who hesitated even once could be quietly replaced. After all, the number always had to stay at 10,000. No gaps, no delays. It was this cold, efficient system that solidified their myth. They didn't just fight with discipline. They lived within discipline. They were honed tools of the empire, polished and sharpened until nothing was left but their unwavering duty. If Cyrus the Great founded the Immortals, it was Darius the Great who meticulously perfected them. When Darius came to power in 522 BCE in the middle of palace intrigue and assassination, the Immortals were the crucial tool he used to legitimize and stabilize his rule. They were no longer just a personal guard. They became a direct extension of royal authority, seamlessly woven into the very fabric of his expanding imperial administration. Darius keenly understood that power did not just depend on military strength, but equally on the powerful illusion of order and inevitability. And nothing showed that image more effectively than the Immortals. He paraded them at grand festivals, had them prominently stationed around his new capital of Persepolis, and sent them on highly visible, high-profile missions. They were always visible, always composed, always the same 10,000 eternal faces of Persian dominance. But Darius also strategically changed their tactical role. Under his smart leadership, the Immortals became a core part of Persian combined arms warfare. No longer just elite infantry, they were often deployed alongside archers, cavalry, and chariots in carefully coordinated attacks. Darius placed immense value on strategic flexibility, and the Immortals were forced to adapt. They trained more rigorously in ranged combat, siege warfare, and complex battlefield coordination. Reports from later Greek observers describe how they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing volleys of arrows while steadily advancing behind their wicker shields, never once breaking formation. They also became heavily involved in putting down numerous rebellions. Darius's vast empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and revolts were common. The Immortals were often the very first wave of retaliation in regions like Elam, Babylon, and Scythia. They acted as both punishment and a clear message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is endless. It was under Darius that they earned a darker reputation. Not just elite warriors, but formidable instruments of fear and retribution. Even their images were elevated. Carvings at Persepolis show them in perfect, stylized, and identical lines, facing eternity in stone. These were not just portraits, they were powerful propaganda. Darius wanted every subject and visitor to understand. These men are always here, always armed, and they do not die. Step out of line, and you'll meet 1 or 10,000. Through Darius, the Immortals became more than just a military unit. They were institutionalized fear, intricately woven into the royal image, deployed with surgical precision, and wrapped in a gold-threaded silence. The Persian Immortals reached the peak of their legend during the reign of Xerxes the Great. And nowhere was their formidable reputation more fiercely tested than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This battle, now deeply mythologized through centuries of art and cinema, wasn't just a clash of opposing armies. It was a symbolic collision between two very different worldviews: Persian imperial order versus Greek city-state defiance. And at the very center of that historical storm stood the Immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the Immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just guard him. They were like a scalpel in the very heart of chaos. Their fearsome reputation alone came before them. The Greeks had heard whispers of the 10,000 who never died, the elite troops who served kings like gods and fought with flawless precision. At Thermopylae, they met a resistance that truly shook their myth. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously 300 Spartans, bravely held the narrow pass against wave after relentless wave of Persian attacks. On the second day of battle, Xerxes specifically ordered the immortals to break the Greek line. It was meant to be a crushing blow. After all, these were the elite of the elite. But what followed was not the instant victory Xerxes had expected. The immortals, as skilled as they were, found themselves severely limited by the tight space of the pass. Their bows were almost useless in such a confined area, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long spears of the Greek hoplites. For hours, they clashed with the highly disciplined Spartans, who fought in tight, interlocking formations, having been trained from childhood for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. The immortals suffered heavy losses. The historian Herodotus noted, perhaps with some satisfaction, that they were no more successful than the ordinary soldiers. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a deep crack in their carefully built image. The immortals had always seemed untouchable, like gods of war in silk and armor. But at Thermopylae they bled. They died. And for the very first time, the illusion of their immortality cracked under the relentless weight of Spartan spears and defiant Greek resolve. Yet, even in defeat, they remained terrifying. They adapted, they regrouped, and they marched again. Immortality, after all, wasn't about being invincible. It was about unwavering endurance. The most fascinating thing about the Persian immortals wasn't just their rigorous training or their effective battlefield tactics. It was their ingenious system. What truly made them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor. It was meticulous administration, a cold, efficient, and relentless bureaucracy. When one immortal fell, whether in battle due to illness or upon retirement, another instantly took his place. There was no mourning period, no elaborate ceremony, just a seamless, immediate replacement. The total number always remained exactly 10,000. This wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was a deliberate design. The Achaemenid Empire operated on precise logistics, and the immortals were the prime example. They maintained a constantly ready pool of trainees and backups, young men carefully groomed to fill vacancies the moment they appeared. These replacements were kept in the capital, supervised, rigorously drilled, and rotated through lesser duties until they were called up. This internal structure made the immortals far more than a static elite unit. They were a living system of excellence, constantly regenerating and evolving. To make this seamless process work, records were kept with meticulous care. Officers known as hazardous, meaning commander of 1,000, oversaw recruitment, discipline, and supply. There were 10 such commanders under the overall leader of the immortals. Below them, a complex network of sub-commanders, scribes, and quartermasters ensured that every man had the correct arms, rations, lodging, and medical support. Lose a man in Egypt, and a replacement was promptly sent from Susa. A soldier breaks a leg during patrol in Media? His successor was already packing his gear. This sophisticated system extended beyond just military readiness. It was deeply psychological. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging warriors served as a powerful tool of imperial terror. If you managed to kill one, another immediately stepped into his place. It didn't matter who they were individually. Their personal identity was irrelevant. Their unwavering presence was eternal. Like a hydra of discipline and silk, the immortals created the powerful illusion of an unstoppable force, because the machine never paused to grieve. Even off the battlefield, this system worked flawlessly. If an immortal's family became disloyal or politically compromised, he was quietly removed and replaced. No scandal, no drama. The line simply moved forward as if nothing had changed. This mechanism, so different when compared to the glory-seeking Greek mindset, was perhaps the immortals' greatest strength. Not individual skill, not fleeting courage, but the cold, undeniable certainty that they could never truly disappear. While the Persian immortals are mainly remembered as formidable warriors, they also served a much subtler role: diplomats in armor. In the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't just about conquest. It was also about presence. And the immortals were often deployed not just to fight, but to be seen, to enter foreign courts as living, breathing representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silk robes, gilded weapons, and impeccable discipline made them terrifying in battle but mesmerizing in peaceful settings. When ambassadors arrived in foreign lands, the immortals often went with them, not primarily for protection, but as a spectacle. Imagine a small, elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men, perfectly synchronized, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine tunics laced with gold, silent and unreadable behind their soft felt headdresses. They didn't shout or threaten. They didn't need to. Their very existence was a form of negotiation. In provinces or satrapies, immortals were regularly stationed to subtly remind local governors where true power ultimately lay. They rarely interfered directly with civil rule, but they were always present, always watching. A mere whisper of rebellion could bring a squad of them directly to a governor's door. Rebellion in the provinces was often stopped before it even began, simply because the alternative, facing the immortals, was considered too dreadful to even think about. Even within the royal court, their presence served multiple functions. They acted as ceremonial guards during festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they diligently monitored courtiers, subtly sniffed out treason, and enforced the king's will with silent efficiency. Some historians argue they functioned almost like an internal intelligence agency, an ever-present warning that loyalty was not optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was a crucial part of their genius. Unlike most elite units of ancient times, who lived solely for the glory of battle, the immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. Warfare was just one tool. Their empire was held together not just by swords, but by powerful symbols. The immortals understood that fear and awe are inherently connected. In foreign courts and remote palaces, their arrival sent a clear, unmistakable message. The king is watching, the empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. And in this powerful way, they often fought wars without ever drawing a blade. All empires eventually grow old, and so do their legends. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the immortals were still feared and widely respected, but no longer truly invincible. The very system that had once made them immortal began to slowly deteriorate, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual creeping decline. As Persian kings became more detached from the battlefield, more concerned with courtly luxury and complex intrigues, the immortals also began to subtly change. They transformed from hardened warriors into more ceremonial royal decorations under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III. The elite guard still existed, still dressed the part, and still marched in perfect formation, but crucial cracks had begun to form. Recruitment standards dropped, and political favoritism started to creep into their once perfect ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and fiercely loyal men were chosen, now nobles pulled strings to place undeserving sons into the sacred 10,000. The result was subtle but ultimately fatal. Uniformity without real spirit, discipline without true heart. This internal decay became tragically clear when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE. At the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the immortals were deployed at the Persian center to defend Darius III. And although they fought with commendable courage, they could not withstand the tactical brilliance and ruthless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed. Worse yet, their powerful myth did not survive the battle. For centuries, the name, Immortals, had inspired deep awe, but Gaugamela undeniably proved they were no longer what they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes I. The system of instant replacement faltered. The backup system that once made their losses invisible simply wasn't in place anymore. The unit never truly recovered. When Alexander marched into Persepolis and took the royal palace, he entered a mere shell of an empire. The immortals were not there to defend it. The unbroken line had, at last, been broken. But their story did not completely end with this defeat. Elements of the immortals lived on. Alexander subtly incorporated Persian traditions into his own army. Later, in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force would rise, sometimes even being called Immortals, again by historians. Though not direct descendants, they powerfully echoed the original myth. 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, and eternal. Even in their fall, the immortals left a lasting blueprint. They had shown the world how to build not just a formidable army, but an enduring legend. The Persian immortals may have vanished from the battlefield, but their profound influence never truly disappeared. Long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the powerful idea of an unbreakable, elite fighting force remained firmly fixed in the imagination of generals, kings, and storytellers. Their legend endured, not because they won every battle, but because they represented something much larger: the very perfection of state-controlled power, an army that did not age, did not question, and did not falter. When the Greeks described them, it was with a curious mix of awe and suspicion. Herodotus famously called them immortals, not because they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. Their replacements were immediate. Their presence was eternal. To the Greeks, this was eerie, almost unnatural. They were used to warfare as a chaotic, intensely personal affair. The immortals were something else entirely: precise, faceless, disciplined to the very edge of humanity. In Roman times, scholars still referenced the immortals when discussing ancient military power. Even Byzantine historians noted the remarkable structure of the Persian elite guard as something to be admired. And in the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who had once guarded kings of old, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The core concept would be revived again in the Sasanian Empire, where an elite cavalry corps, sometimes referred to by historians as the New Immortals, served as the empire's armored fist. Though not directly descended from the Achaemenid unit, they carried the same mission, embodying imperial invincibility. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, centuries later, meticulously studied Persian military organization and praised their precise structure. Culturally, the immortals subtly seeped into myth. Modern media often misrepresents them, transforming them into monsters, demons, or masked assassins. But the truth was far more compelling. They were human, terrifyingly human. Ordinary men transformed into formidable instruments of empire through relentless training, sophisticated psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't require magic to become legendary, just consistency and a profound silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword. It was the powerful idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so, the immortals continue to live on, in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who understand that power, when meticulously organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to true immortality. Music fades out completely. New soft, ambient music begins. Before there were legends of Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians. These nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe were both feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't stay behind in the tents, weaving cloth, or just raising children. They rode horses, skillfully used bows, and bravely went to war. And they didn't just go with men into battle. They led and fought with deadly skill. These were not just exceptions. This was deeply embedded in their culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were astonished when they encountered these remarkable women. He vividly described entire tribes where women firmly refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, originally meant as exotic curiosities, have since been supported by remarkable archaeological proof. Burial mounds known as kurgans, scattered across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have revealed amazing finds. The skeletons of young women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and even clear battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead stuck in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished. These were not just ceremonial weapons. They had been used extensively, and so had she. Scythian society was fundamentally different from its contemporaries. Life on the challenging steppe required both mobility and great resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. Girls learned archery at as young an age as boys did. They wore the same practical leather trousers, the same protective armor. They even styled their hair and tattoos in a similar way, making them almost indistinguishable on horseback in a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture in which gender roles were remarkably fluid on the battlefield, yet perhaps more distinct off it. A Scythian woman could be deadly at a full gallop and then return home to perform traditional ritual and motherly duties. The two roles were not in conflict. They were complementary. Greek myths of the Amazons may very well have been inspired by exaggerated encounters with real Scythian women. But while the Amazons of myth vanished into pure fantasy, the Scythians were undeniably real. They bravely fought Persians, clashed with Greeks, and instilled terror in the Macedonians. And for centuries, they roamed the vast steppe with fire and fury, men and women alike. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, now modern-day Benin, an army made up entirely of women once instilled fear in European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate their formidable power. They were known as the Aguji, but the French notably nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons, a direct comparison to the Greek myths. But these particular warriors were very, very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Aguji had become the standing royal guard of Dahomey's king. But they were far more than just guards. They were elite infantry, rigorously trained to kill, to defend, and to never, ever retreat. Initially, they may have started as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but over time, they evolved into a formal, highly feared military force. Recruited as young girls, often specifically chosen for their strength or unbreakable spirit, the Aguji were separated from their families and put into intense, brutal training. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparred with actual sharpened blades, and swore solemn oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king. They wore distinctive braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes, and clubs. But their most lethal weapon was undoubtedly psychological. European observers during the 19th century were shocked by their apparent fearlessness and brutality. One French officer noted with clear unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, brutally ripped open a man's throat, then calmly wiped her blade clean. These were not symbolic warriors. They were frontline shock troops, often deployed in raids, pitched battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Aguji went head-to-head with seasoned French colonial troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched daring night raids, executed precise ambushes, and fought street by street to defend their kingdom. Their sheer persistence forced French commanders to seriously reconsider their tactics and their preconceived ideas about gender in combat. But it wasn't just their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazons existed in a deeply patriarchal world, yet they meticulously carved out a unique space of total autonomy and profound influence. They advised kings, performed crucial ceremonial duties, and significantly shaped the kingdom's foreign policy. Not from behind the scenes, but with blades firmly in hand. Though the French ultimately defeated Dahomey, the legend of the Aguji never died. In fact, their legacy has helped inspire modern fictional warriors, such as the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But truth, as always, is far more impressive than fiction. In the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through both blood and legend: Tomo Guzan, a formidable samurai warrior of the late 12th century. She fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that ultimately led to the first shogunate. Tomo wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive partner. She was a true commander, a skilled swordswoman, and a masterful archer, rigorously trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and widely feared for her precision in combat. Her compelling story comes most famously from the Heike Monogatari, a sprawling war epic that skillfully blends historical events with poetic flair. In it, Tomo is described as exceptionally beautiful, with fair skin, long hair, and charming features. But the very next sentence delivers the real impact. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000. Beauty and deadliness were not contradictions. They were perfectly fused within her. Tomo served under Minamoto no Yashinaka, a warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto. She wasn't just a camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was directly in the middle of the action, reportedly leading troops and even personally killing multiple enemies in single combat. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yashinaka ordered his desperate last stand. Rather than fleeing, Tomo chose to fight. In one of her most famous encounters, she is said to have dismounted a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot. She then calmly remounted and continued into the chaos. That moment, possibly exaggerated but quite possibly true, has endured for centuries as a powerful symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. But what ultimately happened to Tomo after the war remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claim she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she became a nun, retreating into a life of silence. Still others believe she simply vanished, like a ghost, back into the mists of legend. Whatever the truth, the powerful legacy of Tomo Guzan survived in theater, folklore, and national memory. In a society fundamentally built on rigid gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomo Guzan stood strikingly apart, her blade drawn, head held high, and utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord. She was fighting for her right to exist in a world that explicitly told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak. Disciplined, highly organized, and seemingly unstoppable. But then came Boudica, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia who very nearly brought the formidable Roman machine to its knees. Her name would powerfully echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, fierce national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Roman rule, a puppet ruler allowed to maintain power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome brazenly ignored his will and moved to seize his lands outright. In the process, Roman officials publicly whipped Boudica and, according to the historian Tacitus, raped her daughters. It was a brutal, humiliating act, specifically designed to crush any potential rebellion. Instead, it ignited a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica successfully united several British tribes and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in all of Roman history. And she was no mere figurehead. Roman accounts describe her personally leading her army from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic and a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery red hair streamed behind her as she rode, passionately calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her combined forces descended on Camulogenum, modern Colchester, burning it completely to the ground. Next came Londinium, the early seed of modern London, where she ruthlessly slaughtered Roman colonists and utterly destroyed the city. Historians estimate over 70,000 Romans and their sympathizers were killed in just a few short months. Her army left behind a devastating trail of ash and shattered arrogance. But the Romans, under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they skillfully lured Boudica into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and their superior formation tactics proved decisive. The rebellion was ultimately crushed. Boudica, facing inevitable defeat, is said to have taken poison rather than endure capture. Though her uprising ultimately failed, Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians, while depicting her as a barbarian, grudgingly acknowledged her courage and leadership as impossible to ignore. For the British, especially in later centuries, she became a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. In the war-torn steppes of Central Asia, during the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who struck fear into seasoned warriors and embarrassed proud princes, not with a sword, but with sheer, undeniable physical dominance. Her name was Kudelin, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan himself. But she didn't just ride in his formidable shadow. She meticulously carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Kudelin was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan and a rival claimant to leadership within the Mongol Empire. Kudelin was raised much like a warrior prince, rigorously trained in archery, expert horse riding, and fierce battlefield tactics. But she stood out most for her extraordinary talent in wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Kutulan famously vowed she would only marry a man who could defeat her in a wrestling match. Many suitors attempted, and all of them failed. Dozens of suitors walked away defeated and utterly humiliated, some even betting horses, gold, or entire herds on their chances. It is said she amassed an astonishing 10,000 horses from her victories, transforming her into not just a champion, but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Kutulan wasn't just throwing men onto the dirt for sport. She fought bravely alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines. During campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, Kutulan was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even seriously considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture so heavily dominated by male warlords. This, unsurprisingly, sparked considerable backlash among some Mongol nobles, who whispered that her influence was unnatural and her power far too threatening. In the end, Kaidu did not make her his direct heir, choosing a male relative instead. But her formidable reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled extensively through the Mongol Empire, wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as well as any man. Later histories tried to romanticize or minimize her, turning her into a love-struck figure or reducing her story to mere legend. But make no mistake, Kutulan was real, and her strength was truly legendary. She powerfully demonstrated that in the very heart of the most male-dominated empire on Earth, a woman could still rise to prominence, not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. In a time when women couldn't vote, freely own land, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only put on armor, she bravely led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in a tiny village called Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl. Yet by the age of 17, she would command troops, confront kings, and fundamentally change the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her meteoric rise was not born from formal military training or noble lineage. Joan claimed divine inspiration. She asserted that she heard voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who explicitly told her that she had been chosen to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a wild claim, one that should have resulted in her being dismissed as mad. Instead, it miraculously got her an audience with the future King Charles VII. The court thoroughly tested her, and clergy questioned her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They saw something in her. Undeniable conviction, profound charisma, something utterly unexplainable. And so, clad in white armor, her banner flying high, Joan was sent to Orleans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's critical turning point. French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's mere presence revitalized their spirits. She didn't just stand on the sidelines. She personally led charges, bravely faced arrows, and rallied troops directly under fire. Against all odds, the French successfully lifted the siege. The victory electrified the entire nation. Joan became famously known as the Maid of Orleans, a powerful symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a string of remarkable victories, she escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king, exactly as the voices had foretold. But immense power, fame, and miraculous achievements inevitably come with enemies. In 1430, she was tragically captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Tried by a pro-English church court, Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and notably wearing male clothing, a crime punishable by death. She was just 19 years old when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace. But her death only magnified her legend. Years later, the church formally reversed her conviction, and centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. By the time Nakano Takiko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm traditionally favored by samurai women, Japan was undergoing rapid and dramatic change. It was the late 1860s, and the revered samurai class was being systematically dismantled as the country eagerly modernized. But in one final, defiant stand for the old ways, this young woman would etch her name into history as the last true Onibi geisha, a female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nakano Takiko was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she diligently studied Confucian classics, mastered elegant calligraphy, and most importantly, rigorously trained in martial arts. Her favored weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was deeply symbolic. Traditionally used by women of the samurai class, it allowed for extended reach and gracefully fluid combat. Under the guidance of her adoptive father and martial arts master, she trained until her skill rivaled that of the best men in her domain. By her early 20s, Nakano had become both an esteemed educator and a formidable warrior, teaching other women the ways of the sword. But in 1868, when the Boshin War erupted, a brutal civil conflict between the imperial forces and the old Tokugawa shogunate, Nakano did not stay behind. She bravely joined the defense of Eizu, one of the last bastions of traditional samurai resistance. Women were not officially allowed to serve, but Nakano formed an unofficial unit of female fighters known as the Joshigan, or Women's Army. Clad in hakama pants and traditional armor, these women fought fiercely alongside the men, protecting their families, their city, and their cherished way of life. At the Battle of Eizu, Nakano personally led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with rifles. According to witnesses, she killed several enemies before being tragically shot in the chest. Knowing she was mortally wounded and unwilling to be captured or defiled, she bravely asked her sister to behead her. Her body was subsequently buried at a temple in Fukushima, her trusted sword placed beside her. Nakano's bravery was legendary, even in defeat. Today, statues of her stand proudly in Japan, particularly in Eizu, where she is remembered not only as a formidable warrior but as a woman who steadfastly refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or to death itself. In the smoldering ruins of World War II, one name sent shivers down the spines of German soldiers on the Eastern Front: Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies, she wasn't a myth, a mere morale booster, or a propaganda figure. She was the real thing. A Soviet sniper who meticulously tallied 309 confirmed kills, including an astonishing 36 enemy snipers. She stands as the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was fiercely competitive from a young age. She possessed an intense patriotism and demonstrated a natural aptitude for marksmanship. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and diligently studying history at university. But instead of books, she picked up a rifle and courageously volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she become a nurse. She adamantly refused. She wanted a combat role and she got one. Deployed to the front lines during the siege of Odessa and later the protracted siege of Sevastopol, Pavlichenko earned her formidable reputation the hard way. She spent long hours motionless, meticulously camouflaged in freezing terrain, patiently waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets weren't just common foot soldiers. She meticulously hunted officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She operated with nerves of steel, a patience bordering on supernatural, and an absolute hatred for the invaders. Her kill count climbed so remarkably high that she was eventually pulled from the front and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. There, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and formed a strong friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who greatly admired her composure and intellect. Pavlichenko delivered powerful speeches, urging the Allies to open a second front in Europe, and openly mocked reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she did not retreat into obscurity. She earned her degree, became a historian, and diligently trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she suffered from war-related trauma and injuries, her powerful legacy endured. She received the prestigious Hero of the Soviet Union medal and remains a revered national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that often questions the place of women in warfare, Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not argue. She did not protest. She simply performed the job better than almost anyone who ever lived. For every famous name, Boudica, Tomo Guzin, Ludmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose compelling stories have unfortunately slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, was largely written by men. And when women bravely picked up swords, rifles, or spears, their stories were often omitted, downplayed, or transformed into mere myth. But let there be no mistake. Warrior women have been present all along, across continents and across centuries, and their silence was certainly not voluntary. Consider the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Ni, who courageously led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of devoted followers, and successfully ruled an independent state for 3 years before eventually being crushed by superior Chinese forces. Their remarkable resistance is still commemorated today with temples and festivals in their honor, even though global history books rarely mention them. Or Yara Santawa of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who in 1900 led a powerful rebellion against British colonial forces. As Queen Mother, she valiantly rallied her people when the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the ultimate symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She delivered fiery speeches and personally led her troops in battle, clearly demonstrating that leadership and defiance knew no gender. There were Viking shield maidens, likely not as common as legend suggests, but very much present. Archaeological finds consistently confirm that women were buried with weapons, armor, and even war horses, not as ceremonial tokens, but as actual warriors. There were Apache women fighters in the American Southwest, like Lozin, a spiritual warrior who rode and fought bravely beside her brother, the famous leader Victorio. In every era, in every region, warrior women fought, not always to conquer, but to protect, to defend their families, their cultures, and their homes. Some led entire armies. Others fought as lone figures in resistance movements. Some were queens. Some were humble peasants. But all of them shattered the persistent lie that warfare belonged exclusively to men. Today, their rich legacy is steadily being reclaimed. From rigorous scholarly research to compelling pop culture representations, the powerful stories of these women are finally resurfacing. And each rediscovered name serves as a poignant reminder. History is not just what was written, it is also what was deliberately erased. These women did not ask to be remembered. They simply asked to be respected. And slowly, but surely, the world is beginning to listen. Music fades out completely. New soft, ambient music begins. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music was not just mere entertainment. It was profound ritual, immense power, and an intricate language. And no instrument embodied this more profoundly than the lyre. Among the world's earliest stringed instruments, the Mesopotamian lyre dates back over 4,500 years, emerging from the Sumerian city of Ur, where music was intimately woven into both sacred temple ceremonies and vibrant royal court life. The lyres of Ur were not simple harps carved from wood. They were intricate, beautifully crafted objects, often adorned with shimmering gold, gleaming silver, brilliant lapis lazuli, and intricately detailed animal motifs. One of the most famous examples is the bull-headed lyre, astonishingly discovered in a royal tomb in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley. Its soundbox was shaped like a bull's body, and the instrument's head was covered in delicate gold leaf, its beard meticulously crafted from lapis. But this wasn't just for show. The bull was a potent symbol of strength, and its presence on a lyre may have held deep spiritual significance, not just decorative appeal. Played with the fingers or a small pick, the lyre produced a resonant, haunting tone. Though we cannot hear ancient melodies exactly as they were performed, scholars believe the Sumerians used a 7-note scale, much like modern Western music. Clay tablets inscribed with early musical notation provide tantalizing clues, clearly showing that sophisticated music theory and precise scale construction existed even then. These lyres were not confined to palace halls. In temples, music accompanied offerings and prayers to the gods. Hymns were sung with lyre accompaniment in honor of deities like Inanna and Enlil, thereby transforming music into a sacred bridge between the human and the divine. In funerary rites, lyres mournfully played for the dead, believed to help guide souls into the afterlife. They were not simply instruments. They were profound voices of transition and transformation. Mesopotamian musicians held a highly respected role in society. Some were female priestesses. Others were accomplished court performers. They memorized complex songs passed down orally, often learning from a young age within structured schools for scribes and musicians. Today, replicas of these ancient lyres are played in museums and at reconstructions, their soft, twanging echoes serving as a poignant reminder that long before Mozart, before medieval minstrels, or even Homer's sung epics, humans were plucking strings in the desert, earnestly chasing both beauty and sound. While the lyre sang gently to the gods, the aulos screamed, wept, and danced through the very hearts of the ancient Greeks. This reed-blown, double-piped wind instrument was no gentle flute. It was wild, intensely emotional, and unyielding. To the Greeks, music was not just entertainment. It was ethos, a powerful force that profoundly shaped the soul. And the aulos embodied its most primal edge. Unlike the lyre, which symbolized harmony and order and was favored by the god Apollo, the aulos was directly associated with Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. It was frequently played during sacred rituals, dramatic theatrical performances, and even military marches, giving it a wide range of emotional and functional uses. It typically consisted of two pipes, usually crafted from wood, bone, or ivory, each with its own reed and fingering holes. The musician, or aulits, played both pipes simultaneously, producing a dense, penetrating sound closer to a bagpipe than a modern flute. This required incredible breath control. Musicians often used a technique called circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while simultaneously pushing air out through the cheeks, allowing them to play continuously. The effort often subtly warped their faces and significantly puffed out their cheeks, so much so that athletes sometimes mockingly criticized aulits for their awkward appearance. Yet, despite the jokes, aulits were respected, even revered in certain circles. The aulos was not intended for calm, background music. It stirred the blood. In ancient Greek theater, it accompanied profound tragedies and comedies, adding powerful mood and dramatic momentum to performances by Sophocles and Euripides. In battle, its blaring voice helped keep hoplites marching in disciplined step, slicing through the chaos of conflict. And during baksheik rituals, it propelled dancers into trance-like states, dissolving the distinct line between performer and the divinely possessed. Plato had a complex relationship with the aulos. In his Republic, he famously dismissed it as too emotionally overwhelming, preferring instruments like the lyre and kithara for their perceived intellectual clarity. Yet, even he couldn't deny its raw power. The aulos could simulate deep sorrow, mimic intense fury, or stir profound euphoria, sometimes all in the very same breath. Today, fragments of ancient aulos pipes survive in museums, and modern reconstructions hint at its raw, untamed energy. Unlike the mathematically balanced lyre, the aulos wasn't about perfection. It was about visceral release. It carried the authentic sound of frenzy, mourning, seduction, and war. In the ancient courts and scholarly studios of China, music was far more than mere art. It was philosophy in motion. And few instruments embody this concept more profoundly than the guqin and the guzheng, two distinct stringed zither that carried the sounds of dynasties, deep meditation, and poetic introspection. While they may appear similar at a glance, each served a unique and distinct role in shaping China's rich musical identity. The guqin is the elder of the two, an instrument with over 3,000 years of documented history. With 7 strings and a long, fretless wooden body, it produced quiet, incredibly subtle tones. To the untrained ear, the guqin sounds almost whisper-like, gentle slides, ethereal harmonics, and softly plucked notes that echo like raindrops on ancient tile. But to Chinese scholars and sages, these sounds reflected the delicate balance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself was famously said to play the guqin, believing it cultivated moral character and profound inner harmony. In ancient China, learning to play the guqin wasn't about becoming a public performer. It was about becoming truly civilized. Contrast this with the guzheng, a younger, somewhat louder cousin with a brighter, more vibrant sound, and a more public life. With 16 to 21 strings, or even more in modern versions, the guzheng was specifically built for performance. Its elegantly curved wooden frame and movable bridges allow for rich, flowing melodies and dramatic glissandos. Musicians pluck the strings with picks attached to their fingers, creating cascades of notes that shimmer like flowing water. It was favored in palaces, played in folk music, and even found its place in military camps. Where the guqin whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang directly to the crowd. Both instruments played significant roles in ritual and storytelling. The guqin often accompanied poetry readings, philosophical lectures, and periods of quiet meditation. The guzheng, conversely, was used in banquets, operas, and to recount sweeping historical epics. Its music could mimic galloping horses, flowing rivers, or the poignant sound of weeping lovers, all skillfully conveyed through vibrating silk strings and masterful fingerwork. These instruments also represented nuanced gendered spaces in ancient China. The guqin was traditionally played by male scholars, while the guzheng became more closely associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Yet, both were deeply respected, taught in prestigious musical academies, and firmly integrated into the Confucian ideals of a balanced education. Today, both the guqin and guzheng are still actively played, having been revived in both classical and contemporary settings. They remain living echoes of China's ancient soul, where music was not only heard but profoundly felt as a direct path to virtue and immense emotional depth. In ancient Egypt, music was not just background noise. It was a sacred tool, a powerful form of divine communication that resonated through temples, tombs, and every aspect of daily life. From pharaohs to peasants, music was omnipresent. It soothed weary laborers, honored the departed, guided complex religious rituals, and entertained the living. And the instruments that shaped this unique soundscape were as diverse as the Nile River itself. One of the oldest and most iconic Egyptian instruments was the harp. Early harps, gracefully curved like bows, gradually evolved into larger, angular harps that stood as tall as a man. These instruments were played by plucking the strings with the fingers, often by dedicated temple musicians or talented court entertainers. Harps were not merely for artistic expression. They were intimately associated with the afterlife. Tomb paintings frequently depict harpists playing for the souls of the dead, believed to gently ease their journey into eternity. Then came the sistrum, a sacred rattle intimately associated with the goddess Hathor, the protector of music, motherhood, and joy. Crafted from metal with loose crossbars, the sistrum produced a distinct jangling sound when shaken. It wasn't subtle, but it was undeniably powerful. Used extensively in temples to summon gods, purify sacred spaces, and drive out malevolent spirits, the rhythmic shaking of a sistrum was believed to appease deities and maintain cosmic order. Flutes, often crafted from reed or bone, contributed airy, breathy melodies to religious processions and rituals. The double clarinet, with its two pipes played simultaneously, created a rich, buzzing harmony, serving as a clear predecessor of the Greek aulos. Percussion was provided through frame drums, hand clappers, and even castanets, particularly in dances and festivals. Professional musicians in Egypt held respected positions. Many were women, frequently depicted in art as harpists and singers, often serving in temples. These women were more than mere entertainers. They were chantresses of Ammonius, musicians of Isis, figures of significant spiritual power. Music served to honor gods, accompany offerings, and mark the profound transitions between life and death. Egyptian musical notation remains largely elusive. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, few specific musical records survive. But their instruments, vividly depicted in tombs and temples, tell us a great deal. Ancient Egyptians understood music as intricate structure, profound emotion, and deep magic. Even in death, music was deemed essential. Instruments were carefully buried with the elite, their owners believing they would play again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. To them, music wasn't a pastime. It was eternity's very language. Long before written words etched history into stone, ancient African cultures used something far more primal and immediate: rhythm. Across the vast continent, drums were not just instruments. They were living voices. They spoke, commanded, remembered, and summoned. In Africa's ancient societies, music, especially percussion, was a living, breathing language that carried stories, laws, identities, and the very pulse of the divine. Drums varied widely by region and purpose, but one of the most iconic was the talking drum, found predominantly in West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass and strung with leather cords, this drum could skillfully mimic the tonal languages of the people. Skilled drummers could speak entire phrases by adjusting tension on the cords while striking the drum with a curved stick. Messages were effectively sent across villages, announcing births, deaths, warnings, or royal summons. Long before the invention of paper or the postal system, the drum became the continent's first sophisticated wireless communication system. But drums weren't just practical. They were deeply spiritual. In kingdoms like ancient Kush and Nak, drums summoned ancestors and deities. In Ife and Benin, they honored kings and gods in elaborate court rituals. Drumming was central to initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, and funerals. It was said that to beat a sacred drum was to awaken forces beyond the veil. African drums came in countless forms: djem, dun-dun, bugarabu, and keet, each with specific roles in the intricate musical hierarchy. They were carved from single logs, meticulously hollowed and fitted with animal hide, each tuned to a specific pitch or tone. The craftsmanship was sacred, passed down from father to son, with rituals observed even during the making of the instrument. And percussion didn't stop at drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and thumb pianos added rich layers of rhythm and melody, creating a complex, polyrhythmic soundscape that Western music wouldn't fully comprehend until centuries later. In African tradition, music was inseparable from movement. You didn't just listen, you danced, breathed, and sweated with it. The drummer wasn't a mere performer. He was a conduit, channeling energy, spirit, and communal memory. These powerful rhythms traveled through the trans-Saharan trade routes, through the Nile, and later, tragically, through the Atlantic slave trade, shaping diasporic music from Brazil to the Caribbean. But their heart remained always in Africa, where the beat wasn't just entertainment. It was identity, ancestry, and profound survival. High in the Andean mountains, where the air thins and the clouds brush the earth, music floated through the stone cities and terraced fields, not from strings or drums, but from the very wind itself. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and Inca developed a rich musical tradition centered around aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most famously, panpipes or siku. The siku is a deceptively simple-looking instrument. It consists of multiple reeds or bamboo tubes of varying lengths, lashed together in a single row or sometimes stacked in double rows. Each tube plays one note, and players alternate rapidly between rows to create intricate melodies. The result is a haunting, breathy harmony that echoes across mountains like a deep conversation with the wind itself. Siku ensembles were often played in pairs, with two players performing alternating notes in interlocking patterns, a technique called hocketing, which symbolized the Andean ideal of duality and balance in both nature and society. Flutes, crafted from bone, clay, or reed, were also widespread. Some were so small they could hang from necklaces. Others were large enough to produce deep, resonant tones. Many were intricately carved in the shapes of birds, snakes, or spirits, clearly demonstrating the strong spiritual link between sound and the natural world. These were not merely musical instruments. They were sacred tools. Music was used to call for rain, bless harvests, honor the sun, or communicate with ancestors. One particularly fascinating discovery is the ceramic whistling vessels of the Moche civilization. When water was poured into them, internal chambers forced air through a whistle, producing eerie tones, quite literally musical pottery. These were likely used in rituals, cleverly combining water, air, and sound into a single ceremonial act. In Inca society, music accompanied every significant stage of life, from birth celebrations to funerals, from military parades to agricultural festivals. There was a specific melody for every moment. Inca musicians played for gods like Inti, the sun, and Pachamama, the earth, offering their very breath as a profound form of spiritual devotion. Even soldiers marched with coordinated flute music, transforming warfare into a kind of ritual choreography. Though Spanish colonization nearly erased many native traditions, the distinctive sound of Andean flutes never fully vanished. Today, their echoes can still be heard in the Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages. An ancient voice of stone, wind, and sky, still singing melodically in the thin air. In ancient India, music was far more than a performance. It was considered a form of cosmic engineering. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe itself was believed to have been created from sound, originating from the primordial vibration known as Om. From this profound belief grew one of the world's most intricate and enduring musical traditions, deeply rooted in ritual, mathematics, and spiritual transformation. Early texts like the Vedas, dating back to at least 1500 BCE, already contain hymns known as Saman chants, which were meant to be sung, not just recited. These hymns formed part of sacred rituals, with specific melodies designed to align the soul with divine forces. The priestly class, the Brahmins, were meticulously trained not only in philosophy and fire offerings, but also in voice modulation and precise musical cadence. Absolute precision was essential. Mispronouncing a note could, in theory, corrupt the entire ritual. The earliest instruments used in Vedic and post-Vedic India served both sonic and symbolic roles. The veena, a plucked string instrument with a resonating gourd, became a powerful symbol of learning and divine expression. It was, and still is, intimately associated with the goddess Sarasvati, the deity of wisdom and the arts. Its strings were believed to echo the very vibrations of the cosmos, allowing the player to connect with universal truths through melody. Wind instruments like the bansuri, bamboo flute, were not only tools for creating melody, but also powerful vehicles of myth. Lord Krishna, the god of love and divine play, was frequently depicted playing the flute, charming humans and animals alike. The sound of the bansuri was believed to pierce the illusions of reality and transport listeners to a higher state of consciousness. Percussion also held immense power. The mridangam and tabla were not just rhythm keepers. They mirrored heartbeats, breath patterns, and cosmic cycles. Rhythms, or talas, were complex mathematical patterns, some cyclical, some asymmetrical, each intricately linked to specific emotional states and times of day. Indian music was deeply tied to rasa theory, the belief that music should evoke specific emotional flavors, like love, heroism, serenity, or sorrow. Even in ancient times, ragas, melodic frameworks, were meticulously designed to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient traditions that have been lost to time, India's musical roots have not only survived, they have continuously evolved. But at their very core remains the same ancient belief that to make music is to deeply touch the divine. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, from the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Maya and Aztecs, music was utterly inseparable from the sacred. It wasn't merely art. It was profound power, used to commune with gods, sanctify blood offerings, summon rain, and terrify enemies. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, music was, in essence, ritual technology, an invisible thread linking humans to the divine and the realm of the dead. Drums dominated the soundscape. The most iconic was the huedel, a tall, single-headed drum carved from hollowed tree trunks and played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and adorned with intricate glyphs or sacred images, the huedel throbbed during festivals, warfare, and sacrifices. Its deep, resonant sound echoed through stone courtyards like the very heartbeat of the gods. Then came the teponazli, a slit drum made of hollowed wood, played with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was carved into two tongues that produced different pitches when struck. The teponazli was not just percussive. It could speak. In the Aztec language, It was said that the teponazli could sing the names of deities or the rhythmic patterns of fate itself. Wind instruments were also central to their musical traditions. Flutes made of bone, clay, and reed were common, often shaped like animals or gods. Some were so intricately made that they could mimic bird calls, jaguar growls, or even human screams. In fact, the infamous Aztec death whistle, shaped like a skull and blown like a flute, produces a blood-chilling shriek, possibly used during warfare or sacrificial ceremonies to strike terror into enemies or to open portals to the spirit world. Music accompanied every major event: birth, coming-of-age rites, warfare, agricultural cycles, and death. Musicians and dancers trained in special schools, performing not just for crowds but directly for the gods. Certain instruments were strictly reserved for nobles or priests. Playing them incorrectly could be considered a spiritual offense. Even sacrifice, a central practice in Aztec religion, was carried out to a meticulous musical score. Drums pounded, flutes wailed, and conch shells howled while hearts were offered to the sun. The music didn't soothe, it activated. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the cosmic engine turning. In Mesoamerica, music was not a mere backdrop. It was the ceremony. It was not meant to entertain. It was meant to transform. Though the civilizations of antiquity have long since risen and fallen, their music has never truly died. It continues to linger, not always in audible sound, but in ritual design, in cultural memory, and deeply within our very cultural DNA. In many ways, ancient music was never intended to be preserved in written sheet music or captured in recordings. It was passed down through hands, through mouths, and through hearts. A living tradition meticulously encoded in memory and vibrant performance. Consider the Chinese guqin or the Indian veena. These are not mere museum pieces. They are still actively played today, often using techniques that have been passed down for millennia. Performers don't simply mimic ancient sounds. They embody them. Each note carries centuries of philosophy, culture, and deep meditation. In a single pluck, you can feel the same profound longing or exquisite joy that an ancient emperor or a wise sage once experienced. In Africa, the drums continue to speak. The rhythms of the gem, the call and response of the kora, the syncopation of traditional dance, all echo ancient practices that predate colonial maps or written history. Even in the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous tribes reflects the powerful echoes of ancestral voices. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are inspired reinventions, but the profound roots are undeniably ancient. Even in modern Western music, ancient concepts remarkably survive. The seven-note heptatonic scale, first used in Mesopotamia, laid a fundamental groundwork for modern harmony. Greek music theory, its modes, intervals, and concept of ethos, fed directly into early Christian chant and the eventual birth of classical music. And the instruments themselves? The lyre evolved into the lute, which in turn birthed the guitar. The aulas's double reed design inspired the oboe and the bassoon. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the profound purpose of ancient music. It was not meant to sell tickets or top charts. It was ritual. It was healing. It marked birth and death, sowing and harvest, love and war. It truly meant something. Even today, music remains our universal language, capable of stirring deep emotion without words, of creating community without physical walls. In a digital world often overflowing with distracting noise, ancient music serves as a poignant reminder that sound can be sacred, that rhythm can be memory, and that melody can be a powerful thread connecting worlds. Whether whispered from a guqin, shouted through a war drum, or piped from a clay flute, the songs of our ancestors still echo. We just need to listen,